There are truths in the galaxy so perilous, so fundamentally corrosive to the sanity of man, that even the Inquisition does not speak of them aloud. Not in their vaulted halls, not within the secure codes of data vaults, not even in thought. Among them, whispered only by the mad and the dying, is the heresy that there may have once been another chaos power, a fifth god of the immaterium, one born not in ancient time, but amidst the smoldering ruin of the 36th Millennium, and then snuffed out with such terrifying finality that even memory itself was scorched from the warp and real space alike. Imagine the sheer magnitude of will and horror required not merely to deny a god worship, but to erase its name from the fabric of reality. No records, no cults, no symbols. Only hints remain, tangled in forbidden texts and warp-racked prophecies. For if the warp is shaped by emotion, and if gods are born from belief and feeling, then what kind of moment, what galactic scream, could have birthed something so potent and alien that even the four ruinous powers themselves turned against it? Or worse, feared it. Before the known pantheon of chaos had fully emerged, before the rise of Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, the warp was not empty, but it was wild, an ocean of unformed potential, writhing with echoes of mortal thought and emotion. It was a sea of half-gods and spectral entities, transient reflections of the mortal mind, flaring into being and vanishing as quickly. It is here, in this untamed epic of the immaterium, that one must begin to understand the possibility of a fifth power, because the warp is not static. It is a living reflection of conscious beings, and once, long ago, it may have held very different dominions. In the darkness before the Four took dominion, emotion had not yet coalesced into divinity. There were primal storms of wrath, but no Khorne, wheels of change and scheming threads without the name of Tzeentch. Sickness spread in psychic space, but Nurgle had not yet smiled his bloated grin, and desire throbbed in shadowed corners, unclaimed by Slaanesh. These forces existed certainly, but they were raw, formless, more akin to natural disasters than gods. It's plausible, even probable, that other emotions, less explosive, more insidious, once festered and built strength in that primordial soup. Terror not of violence, but of emptiness. Apathy so deep it became a force of entropy. Nihilism, dread. These may have been early ingredients of something else entirely. The rise of the Four was not instantaneous. The war in heaven, the fall of the Eldar, and the psychic awakening of humanity each poured new energies into the immaterium. Yet in the gaps between these titanic events, there was silence, a lull that may have been filled by other entities. Ancient Xenos races long dead could have birthed transient powers. The Necrontire, even in their war against the Old Ones, may have left scars in the warp. The Hrud, with their entropy fields and time-decaying presence, might once have worshipped something that lingers still, malformed and inert, waiting. In such a time, without a dominant pantheon, something alien might have flourished. Something fragile, obscure, but real. Even the early warpsmiths and proto-sorcerers of the pre-imperial era spoke in hushed tones of strange currents in the immaterium. Not rage, not hope, not decay, something else. A coldness, the refusal to feel. It was not evil, not even malevolent, but it unsettled them. Some postulated it was not a god in the making, but the antithesis of one, a counterforce to belief itself, a thing that fed not on worship, but on its absence. The void between shrines, the silence between prayers. Perhaps the fifth power was seated not in violent acts or ecstatic desire, but in universal indifference, a cold turning away. As the Four gained strength through the age of strife and the psychic blossoming of the galaxy, it is conceivable this other force, born not from intensity but from negation, was being quietly choked, not by violence, but by the noise of emotion itself. A being of emptiness, smothered by the passion that fuels all warp entities. Yet it is also possible that before the dominance of the Four, such a power had its own reign. A time before names, when gods were shadows and their worshippers barely aware of the shapes they honored. Back then, even the laws of the warp were mutable. Perhaps in that time, the fifth power walked unchallenged, unknown, and unbound. Not a god of mortals, but of forgetting, of silence, of the death of ideas. Not the antithesis of chaos, but a neutralization of it. The suppression of chaos by void. Such a force would be unthinkable now. Yet the warp remembers everything, even that which mortals cannot. The ancient Eldar myths hint at a silent adversary, neither monstrous nor divine, but suffocating. In the cradle songs of Ulthanesh, there is mention of the Veil of Grey, a force that came not with fangs but with silence, sapping will from the gods of their old pantheon. The tale was dismissed as a metaphor for despair, but what if it wasn't? What if it was a reference to something that once competed with the Laughing God, the Weeping Maiden, and the many strange deities of that long-fallen civilization? In the age of Terra's techno-barbarism, few dared to peer into the warp unaided. But among those who did, there are strange, unverified reports. A psychic engineer of the Ursh claims to have encountered an entity that did not speak, did not roar, but watched. It gave no gifts. It offered no temptation. It merely was. That engineer took his own life days later, writing only one phrase in blood on the walls of his sanctum. It sees no difference. To those who study such esoterica, this line is chilling, suggesting a godlike indifference that sees no joy or suffering, no triumph or failure. An eternal gray. The warp before the Four may have been pregnant with forgotten possibilities. And in that vast shadow, a fifth power could have gestated in the folds of human dread and Xenos lamentation. A god of loss, a power of the absence, not one that warps the soul, but one that slowly unwinds it. And in its annihilation, if indeed it was born and then killed, we may be looking at something far more terrifying than any demon prince, the possibility that the warp itself can mourn. The 36th Millennium was not an era defined by grand victories or noble ascents. It was a time of corrosion, quiet, pervasive, and unnervingly effective. The Imperium had begun to rot not from external assault, but from within. Ecclesiastical power metastasized like a spiritual tumor, choking reason, blinding faith with hierarchy, and turning the imperial cult into a labyrinth of contradictions. In such soil, where belief curdled and loyalty became a pretense, something unnatural may have taken root. Not a god in the traditional sense, but the echo of a god, the reflexive consequence of human collapse. If there was a moment when a fifth chaos power could have emerged, this was it. The warp was in turmoil, its tides storming with emotional runoff from billions of despairing souls. The Great Crusade was ancient history, and the Horus heresy had become less a lesson and more a myth, its truth obfuscated by 10,000 years of ecclesiastical editing. The age of apostasy had only recently scorched the galaxy, with Gogavan Dyer's madness echoing still in the corridors of power. Even after his death, the Imperium did not heal, it calcified. Civil wars flared beneath the surface, High Lords schemed with increasing opacity, and entire sectors grew isolated by warp storms that seemed less random and more intentional. It was during this dark age that certain records, fragmentary and cryptic, begin to describe phenomena that do not align with the influence of the known ruinous powers. Whole sectors fell into silence without signs of demonic incursion. Planets reported mass suicides, not from despair, but from a kind of psychic pressure that seemed to erase desire itself. There were tales of Mechanicus forges going dark, not destroyed by Xenos or war, but as if the will to function had simply evaporated. Black ships reported entire populations of psychers rendered mute and catatonic mid-void, with no sign of demonic possession. A shared phrase found carved into the flesh of several navigator corpses reads, "The light was too heavy." These events center suspiciously around the segmentum obscurus, particularly near the rimward edges of the Cadian Gate. That proximity to the Eye of Terror has often been used to hand-wave such disturbances as ordinary warp turbulence. But these were not demonic incursions. There were no hosts of bloodletters or tide of nurglings, no sensory orgies or twisted mockeries of time. Just void, empty silence, whole ships vanishing into a psychic eclipse. Even the Inquisition seemed paralyzed in its response. Certain Ordo Malleus records are so thoroughly redacted that only timestamps remain. The absence of information in itself begins to speak. Scholars working in heretical secrecy refer to this period as the Veil Eclipse, suggesting that during this window, something immense attempted to breach the real space barrier, not through possession or temptation, but through withdrawal. The theory posits a metaphysical inversion, not a demon entering reality, but reality being gently encouraged to fold inward, to mimic the apathy of the void. If a fifth god was rising, it did not come as a warlord or seducer, but as a void priest. It did not scream, it whispered, and in that whisper, systems died. Some even suggest that the astronomican, long believed to be powered solely by the Emperor's soul, flickered during this period in a way that cannot be explained by mechanical or psychic failure. The light of Terra dimmed for several weeks in the records of certain rogue traders and isolated navigators. These accounts were quickly discredited or vanished entirely, but the implication remains chilling, that something in the warp tried not to blot out the light, but to numb it, to make it irrelevant. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica issued new protocols for astropathic choirs during this time, reinforcing psychic networks and initiating cults of those reporting gray visions. These were dreams in which neither horror nor beauty appeared, only static, the void, and the ever-repeating phrase, "I am not." The phrase is echoed in at least 9 separate data caches recovered from derelict vessels lost in the same time frame. The consistency across disparate incidents is either a hoax of impossible coordination or evidence of something deeply real and deeply unwanted. Despite its monumental implications, this epic was quickly covered up, rewritten, or simply allowed to dissolve in the torrent of war that followed. The 37th Millennium brought with it renewed crusades, Xenos conflicts, and the slow grind of imperial inertia. Whatever had stirred in the warp during the 36th was gone. Not banished in the traditional sense, not defeated, but closed off. Like a door gently shut before anyone noticed it had been open. And yet, if there was ever a time when belief failed across a billion worlds, when the human soul grew quiet and something else began to listen, it was the 36th Millennium. The chaos of that age wasn't kinetic, but psychological. Not a firestorm, but a vacuum, a negation. Something was birthed in silence and perhaps destroyed in it too. Not with a war cry, but with a sigh so deep even the gods forgot to listen. Beneath the towering cathedrals and decaying archives of the Inquisition lie tomes so dangerous they are bound in chains and sealed with psychic wards. Among these, scarcely mentioned even in hushed whispers, are fragments referencing cults that worshipped something nameless. Not a named deity like Khorne or Slaanesh, but a presence that existed only as absence, an entity described through negation, defined by what it was not. These cults left behind no symbols that could be clearly identified, no prayers that called upon a known being. Instead, they practiced rituals of silence, self-erasure, and ritual amnesia. They sought not to exalt the self, but to dissolve it. Unlike the bacchanalian madness of Slaanesh's followers, or the zealotry of Khorne's blood-soaked faithful, the devotees of this unnamed force behaved like shadows. In several instances reported by the Ordo Hereticus, entire settlements had no known ruling body, no religious iconography, no leadership, but still functioned, efficiently, monotonously. When probed, the population gave answers of chilling consistency. We are as we are meant to be. This phrase appears across dozens of disparate worlds, always among communities isolated by warp storms or otherwise cut off during the 36th Millennium. These were not chaos cults in the traditional sense. There were no mutated celebrants, no psychic phenomena of excess or despair. Instead, there was uniformity, obedience without purpose, existence without question. The most unnerving detail is that many of these populations were entirely human in genome, with no signs of corruption. They simply lacked ambition, passion, even the will to resist. The Inquisition found such perfect stagnation more horrifying than any plague or demonic horde. Entire villages burned, not because they were overt threats, but because they represented the negation of the Imperium's purpose, endless violent struggle. Some Inquisitors went mad trying to understand the phenomenon. One such figure, Inquisitor Helbrand of the Ordo Malleus, wrote in his final log, "They worship not with words, but with forgetting. They are the prayer. The silence is their liturgy." Helbrand vanished shortly after visiting the so-called Ashen Moon of Caltris Prime, a lunar colony discovered to have no written records, no artistic expression, and no individual names. Its entire population referred to themselves only as "we." The moon was scoured shortly after, and all data surrounding the incident was sealed under Penitent Protocol Theta Black. Other incidents speak of spontaneous cults arising aboard void ships or within hive underlevels, seemingly without external influence. In these instances, individuals began to participate in coordinated rituals, sitting motionless in complete darkness for hours, ceasing speech entirely for days at a time, or ritually scrubbing documents clean of any emotional or ideological content. In one particularly disturbing case on Forge World Veritex 9, a tech priest faction began disassembling their own machine spirits, reducing functioning logic engines into inert components with no pattern or function. When questioned, they offered no resistance, only the phrase, "The pattern offends. We must remove the shape." From these phenomena emerged speculation that these cults were not acting independently, but responding to a shared psychic pulse, a subliminal call emitted not through dreams or warp entities, but through a kind of psychic anti-signal, a silence that vibrated at a conceptual level, guiding action not with visions, but with absence. If the known chaos gods used dreams, seduction, fury, or despair to spread their touch, then this fifth force worked through stillness, apathy, and the erasure of self. It infected not the mind, but the will. It became a psychic virus of forgetting. The Eldar, too, have fragments of reference to such cults, though they interpret them differently. In some Crone World myths, there is mention of the Unlit Court, a sect that believed the warp itself was a prison and sought to destroy not the galaxy, but the concept of existence. These were not servants of She Who Thirsts, but her rivals, those who believed even desire was a chain. It is said the Laughing God once dueled a member of this unlit court, not with trickery, but with a joke so powerful it reawakened the godling's sense of identity. The story ends, however, with a whisper, but the laugh echoed, and echoes fade. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, there are legends of a forbidden scrap code called Theta Silence. Allegedly unearthed in the ruins of a Dark Age installation, this code was said to contain no commands, only a perfect sequence of null values. When fed into a functioning cogitator, it caused the machine to cease all operations, not crash, but stop, as if forgetting its own existence. The scrap code was deemed a mimetic weapon and purged from all records, or so they claimed. The cults of the Nameless leave behind no grand monuments. They carve no sigils, but they persist in the dark corners of history where records fail and faith falters. Their worship is not loud. It is structural, philosophical, existential. They do not chant. They do not pray. They simply remove meaning, remove memory, remove the gods. And if such cults existed in the 36th millennium, their silence may have been the womb in which a fifth chaos power gestated, nourished not by praise, but by the creeping disintegration of belief itself. When we speak of the warp, we often fall into the trap of seeing it through the narrow lens of its most infamous children: Khorne's fury, Nurgle's rot, Tzeentch's change, and Slaaneish's excess. But the warp is not bound by these four alone. It is shaped by all psychic phenomena, by every flicker of mortal emotion, by every twitch of the soul. The chaos gods are not anomalies within the warp. They are peaks in an ever-shifting ocean. And if that is so, then what might be born from the most neglected emotional states? What might arise not from a scream, but from a whisper so faint it becomes nothing? The idea that a fifth power could rise from emotions not fully mapped by human theology or even Eldar metaphysics is more than plausible. It is terrifying. For while rage, decay, hope, and desire are vivid, tangible, and oft expressed, there exist darker shadows of the mind that are more corrosive, more enduring. Take inertia, not the peaceful kind, but the psychological form, the weight of inaction, the paralysis of will. Not despair, which is active suffering, but the void that follows, the silence after mourning, the numbness that devours passion. This is not absence of feeling, it is the triumph of apathy. A god born of such emotion would not command armies. It would not inspire frenzy or mutation. It would simply unmake purpose. Its essence would be entropy, not in the scientific sense, but in the spiritual, the slow unraveling of the soul's tapestry. Some have speculated that its domain could be described as meaninglessness, or the final victory of futility. Where Khorne makes murder significant, and Nurgle gives suffering a grotesque joy, this fifth force would strip all things of significance. It would laugh, not with madness, but with emptiness. This emotional state is more insidious because it is not easily recognized. It does not blaze. It does not command. It settles in the cracks, in the quiet, in the corners of abandoned temples. It asks no sacrifice, for sacrifice implies value. It asks only surrender. Philosophically, such a being could be viewed as the first truly post-emotional entity in the warp, a god that is not fueled by the heights of emotion, but by its evaporation. It is the end of striving, of struggle, not peace, but anti-motion, anti-being. One might ask, how would such a force gather power? The answer lies in psychic resonance, in times when faith is not shattered violently, but simply worn down, in bureaucracies where zeal becomes rote and dogma becomes meaningless ritual, in warriors who no longer believe in their cause, but fight only from inertia. Every moment of disillusionment, every sigh of fatigue in a hive worker who no longer dreams, these are offerings, not loud ones, but consistent and relentless. Imagine a god whose sacred texts are empty pages, whose rituals involve erasing memory, whose sacred artifact is a void. Such a being would not demand fealty. It would thrive precisely when it was not noticed. Its avatars might be humans who have forgotten their own names, ships that wander into the void and never return, not because they were destroyed, but because they stopped trying to live. It would be worshipped by the act of not worshipping. Belief in it would not be necessary, only the erosion of belief in anything else. And if such a god had once begun to rise, if it had ever found a foothold in the warp, then its destruction would require more than exorcism. It would require the rekindling of meaning, the reassertion of purpose across a galaxy that had given up. Perhaps that is why, during the 36th millennium, the Imperium shifted so violently toward authoritarian orthodoxy. The burning of records, the execution of philosophers, the obliteration of unorthodox cults, these may not have been acts of faith, but acts of survival. Because the only way to fight a god of meaninglessness is to force meaning upon the world with fire and blade. There are those who argue that the warp cannot support a power of absence, that by its very nature it reflects psychic presence. But this misunderstands the spectrum of psychic resonance. Just as sound includes silence, the warp includes the echoes of things not said, feelings not felt. It is why ghosts exist, why memories persist in places where no one remembers. These are the nutrient broth from which a god of negation might have emerged. A god not of nothing, but of the slow, quiet triumph of nothing over everything. Such a power might not have been opposed only by the Imperium. It might have been hunted by the other four, because even the ruinous powers, in all their madness and contradiction, thrive on motion, on drama, on struggle. This fifth power would be the end of all of them, not with conquest, but with irrelevance, the final stillness, a god that wants nothing and teaches all to want the same. There are whispers among certain branches of the Ordo Malleus that the Imperium has, on more than one occasion, done something darker than merely purge cults or silence heresies. These are not the typical exterminatus actions one might associate with chaos infestations or tyrannid incursions. These are more than orbital bombardments or virus bombs. The rumors speak of something older, rarer, and far more forbidden: reality-level purification, a systemic annihilation not of life, but of memory. The belief is that in the 36th Millennium, an entire god was not just destroyed, but erased, its name burned from the stars, its essence snuffed from the warp like smoke in the vacuum. Some heretics call this phenomenon Existential exterminatus, a theoretical protocol by which an event, entity, or even a god can be stripped of its ontological presence. Not destroyed, because destruction leaves ruin. Not banished, because banishment implies return. But made null. The procedure would require unprecedented alignment, psychic nulls on a massive scale, anti-warp rituals woven into mechanized sacrificial systems, and the complete, absolute annihilation of any memory-bearing substrate across entire star systems. The cost would be astronomical, the will required, terrifying. And yet, there are star maps that show missing systems, not bombed, not lost, missing. Systems that once existed in older pre-M40 astrocartographs, noted by rogue traders and explorators, but which do not appear in more recent records. The discrepancy is typically dismissed as transcription error or cartographic drift. But what if these blank zones are not errors? What if they are scars? The kinds of wounds left by something that was once worshipped, something that once shaped the warp, and was then torn from existence, not merely to protect the Imperium, but to protect the gods themselves. Consider the Skald Rift, a small cluster of systems once believed to be key to sub-sector communication lanes in Segmentum Pacificus. In ancient records, they are described as heavily populated, economically vital, and spiritually stable. And then, nothing. The region is now classified as unstable warp terrain. Not even the most daring chartists will enter. Ships vanish. Vox signals scatter into incomprehensible static, and there are no ruins, no planetary debris, just absence. The Inquisition has since barred all investigation. Attempts to breach the zone psychically result in severe neural hemorrhaging in sanctioned psychers, accompanied by a single word echoing through the pain. Why? This kind of existential obliteration can only be justified if what it targets is a greater threat than mere death or corruption. Something so fundamentally corrosive to order that even memory of it cannot be allowed to survive. The theory that a fifth chaos power briefly emerged, gestated in the quiet entropy of a failing Imperium, and was then targeted for obliteration not just by the Inquisition, but by the full weight of every imperial institution, is chilling. It implies a level of awareness and coordination that we do not normally attribute to the Imperium. But perhaps this action wasn't driven by rationality. Perhaps it was driven by instinct, a galactic immune response. If the Imperium indeed purged this fifth god, they would have had to eradicate not only its worshippers, but all records, all rituals, all symbols. A ritual might have been constructed not to banish, but to invalidate, to overwrite the warp's psychic tapestry at that location. Imagine a fleet of black ships not ferrying psychers, but sacrificial martyrs. Imagine a conclave of blank-soul assassins forming the geometric nucleus of a vast negation grid. Imagine an Adeptus Mechanicus data forge sacrificing its own noospheric memory cores to erase a single thought. This is not science fiction. The evidence lies in the nature of warp travel itself. There are zones in the galaxy that once were safe that now cause navigators to bleed from their third eyes. Not chaotic, not storm-racked, just wrong. In a galaxy where every emotion echoes eternally through the warp, these places are silent, unresponsive. They swallow thought. They blur vision. They are not dead. They were murdered. Why would such action be taken? Because a fifth power, if born of entropy, would not only threaten humanity, it would threaten the warp. It would devour the gods, starve them of emotion, turn Slanesh's ecstasy into numbness, Khorne's rage into exhaustion, Nurgle's joy into indifference, Tzeentch's ambition into stillness. This god would have ended not just the Imperium, but the great game itself, and that cannot be allowed. So perhaps the reason we do not remember the fifth god is because that was the victory, not the eradication of a being, but the victory of forgetting, the triumph of fire over silence, a sacrifice made not to save humanity's lives, but to save their will to keep going. There was a time during the 36th Millennium when the astronomican, the holy light of the Emperor that guides humanity across the stars, flickered, not as a result of warp storms or mechanical failure, but as if its soul dimmed. These events, known only to the most senior navigators and a few high-ranking astropaths, were never officially recorded in Imperial archives. And yet, the logs of rogue traders, black flag void ships, and ancient vessels plying the outer dark hold chilling fragments. They speak of voyages where the astronomican vanished for moments, hours, even days. Journeys where the light of the throne was replaced not by chaos, but by nothing. An absence that numbed the soul rather than flayed it. To understand the horror of such an event, one must comprehend the nature of the astronomican. It is more than a beacon. It is a psychic anchor, a lighthouse forged from the will of a god emperor. It allows navigation not through coordinates, but through emotion, through a constant blazing psychic signature. When it dims, the warp grows unfamiliar. But during the alleged Veil eclipse, what navigators encountered was not darkness. It was something worse, an overwhelming sense of meaninglessness, like reaching for a familiar hand and finding not danger, but nothing at all. Navigators describe that time in language usually reserved for religious visions. Some say the light became gray. Others say it turned cold, not in temperature, but in resonance, devoid of all emotional feedback. The astronomican had always been painful to perceive, brilliant and terrible, pulsing with psychic might. But in those moments, it became passive, silent, watching. And some claimed they saw a shape, enormous, slow-moving, unfathomable, obscuring the light. Not like a demonic silhouette, but more like a concept, a notion of forgetfulness, a shape made of no. It was not just the navigators who suffered. Astropaths across the Imperium reported what they later called the dead choirs, periods when multiple astropathic choirs ceased function, not through psychic attack, but as if their will had quietly unraveled. They did not scream. They simply stopped transmitting. Some were found sitting upright, their eyes open, smiles on their lips, all brain dead. But their bodies, when moved, resisted decomposition for weeks, as if held in temporal suspension. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica quarantined these events with ferocious efficiency. Survivors were executed, not silenced, eliminated entirely. The silent tithe is a term whispered among those few librarians and inquisitors who investigate such mysteries. It refers to a supposed agreement made during the Veil eclipse between high-ranking members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the Ecclesiarchy, and certain black ships' captains. The agreement allowed for entire populations of psychers to be redirected to containment sites, often within dead zones of warp space. Not for sacrifice to the Golden Throne, but for something else. A counterweight, a buffer, a psychic firewall against something that had no name but left behind silence wherever it touched. The horror of this moment was not only the threat it posed, but the possibility that it was not a singular event. Some believe the fifth power, whatever it was, used the astronomican itself to speak, not in words or visions, but by muting it, by showing the Imperium what it would feel like to have no guide, no center, no soul. A kind of demonstration of its power, not a roar, but a shrug. A cosmic apathy broadcast through the Imperium's greatest symbol of unity. There are tales of psychers who survived this era and were never the same. They could not dream. They did not eat unless reminded. They spoke only when spoken to, and often paused mid-sentence, as if forgetting what they were. One particularly haunting case involved a choir master who slowly lost all nouns in his vocabulary, referring to people and things only as that or it. His last recorded statement before immolating himself in a psychic firestorm was, "It's gone and so are we, and that's fine." From the black ships to the Navigators Guild, the astronomican's flicker during this time became a signal, not of danger, but of vacuum. And for a brief window, it showed the Imperium a future where its gods, its emperor, and its self-image had all been sanded away. Not replaced, not desecrated, just gone. If this was the fifth god's voice, then it spoke in quiet negation. If it had a form, it was that of a forgotten memory. If it had a goal, it was not conquest, but the ending of all seeking. A final, serene null. And for a terrifying instant, the Imperium saw it and recoiled. Among the many races that traverse the stars, none have a deeper or older connection to the warp than the Eldar. Before the birth of humanity's civilization, before even the rise of the Imperium, the Eldar were already walking through the immaterium, shaping it, dancing with its gods. Their ancient myths, riddled with metaphor and sorrow, speak not only of triumphs and tragedies, but of things best left unremembered. And it is in these myths that we may find the faintest traces of something that does not belong. Something the Eldar feared, not because it was stronger, but because it was nothing. The laughing god, Segarak, is often portrayed as the trickster, the survivor of the fall, the eternal opponent of she who thirsts. Yet even he, in certain tales passed down through Harlequin troops, is said to have closed the curtain on the Grey Room. What is the Grey Room? No two interpretations agree. Some say it is a mental metaphor for despair. Others whisper it was once a real place, a realm of the warp now lost. But there are those who believe the Grey Room was a prison, not for a demon, but for a thought. A concept so dangerous that it had to be sealed, not with chains, but with forgetfulness. The Crone Worlds, those shattered remnants of the Eldar homeworlds consumed by Slanesh, are riddled with psychic echoes. In some ruins, far from the paths of sane explorers, exist murals and sculptures that depict not celebration, nor debauchery, nor war, but stillness. Dancers with blank faces, cities without windows, shrines built not to celebrate, but to suppress. These are not typical of the Eldar aesthetic, which is defined by passion, curvature, and expression. These ruins are geometric, sterile, anti-emotive. And in the center of some of these shrines is the same symbol, a circle not whole but slightly broken, a gap in perfection, a visual representation perhaps of something intentionally left unfinished. It is theorized that the Eldar once faced something that terrified even their gods. Not she who thirsts, who was their doom, but something older, more insidious, an anti-god, a being that did not devour the soul, but quieted it. There are scraps of preserved writings from before the fall that speak of a war of silence, a conflict not waged with blades or magics, but with forgetting, Entire psychic constructs vanishing overnight, emotional spectrums becoming inaccessible, the very idea of struggle dissolving like mist. These texts were, of course, declared fraudulent or allegorical by modern Eldar scholars, but they persist stubbornly, like a scab that won't stop bleeding. The craft world of Ilsariath, lost under mysterious circumstances during the 36th Millennium, is often cited by those who believe in the fifth god's brief rise. Ilsariath was renowned for its radical experimentation with psychic resonance. Its seers sought not to predict the future, but to manipulate the present through subtle harmonic shifts. It vanished without trace. No wreckage, no warp signature, no cries for help. Just gone. Some say it was testing a psychic waveform to harmonize apathy, believing it could shield its people from despair. Instead, it may have attuned them to something far worse. Something that answered not with horror, but with agreement. In the fractured songs of the Exodite world Thuaren, there is a myth of a god who was once offered worship by the Eldar and declined. This god is never named, never depicted. It is said to have no face, no sound, no desire. The story ends not with battle or betrayal, but with the Eldar simply walking away, unable to comprehend it. The implication is clear. It was not defeated. It was simply not understood, and therefore not retained. The Harlequins, perhaps more than any other Eldar faction, preserved these forbidden tales. In one of their oldest performances, the Dance of the Last Thought, a lone figure performs in utter silence while others vanish, one by one, until only the stage remains. No explanation, no closure. The audience is left not with catharsis, but with an ache, a vacuum. The Harlequins insist it is not just art, it is remembrance. Some within the Inquisition who have studied Eldar lore suggest that they may have succeeded where humanity failed, that the Eldar once faced the same fifth power and found a way to forget it, not as individuals but as a species. They severed the neural threads, destroyed the myths, burned the symbols. But the warp never forgets, even when mortals do. And in the brief horror of the 36th Millennium, perhaps the memory stirred again. Not because the god returned, but because its absence became too loud to ignore. To even suggest the ruinous powers of chaos could unite is to flirt with madness. They are not allies. They are not even enemies. They are contradictions, eternal seething opposites locked in a perpetual ballet of betrayal, competition, and existential dissonance. Khorne hates sorcery, yet sometimes permits it. Tzeentch revels in change, while Nurgle embraces decay. Slaanesh craves sensation, while Nurgle dulls it. They do not collaborate, they do not scheme in unison, and yet there are moments in warp history, rare and shrouded in myth, when something greater than rivalry compelled them to act. The 36th Millennium may have been one such moment. What force could drive the gods of chaos, beings of supreme selfishness and infinite egocentrism, to unite, even briefly? Only something that threatened not their dominions, but their very being. And so the theory emerges that the fifth chaos power in its rise was not merely resisted by humanity or the Eldar, but hunted by the very forces of chaos itself. Not out of righteousness, not out of justice, but out of self-preservation. Each chaos god is a monarch of a particular realm within the immaterium, fed by emotion, by faith, by pain and ecstasy and fury. A fifth god, if born not from emotion but its erosion, would represent a cancer. A quiet corruption not of matter, but of myth. It would not claim territory in the warp. It would dissolve it. Not conquer, but neutralize. And for the four great powers, whose identities are shaped by conflict, this could only be interpreted as an existential threat. Unity, then, would not be a choice. It would be a reflex. There are esoteric demonological tracts, blasphemous, hidden, suggesting an event known as the Compact of Silence. supposedly a moment when the greater demons of multiple gods ceased hostilities to pursue a single target, something described only as the void-crowned. Accounts vary wildly, but a common motif persists: demons weeping, not in fear, not in sorrow, but in confusion, as if they were attempting to remember a war they had just fought and could not. Some theorists claim this was not the result of defeat, but the very victory the gods feared, that even their memories of this fifth power had been erased. Consider the greater reality of the warp itself. The warp is a sea of emotion. For it to host something that unravels emotion would be like a fire nurturing ice. The gods are built to oppose each other, but they require that opposition. They define themselves through conflict. A power of silence would offer no such luxury, no rival, no nemesis, just indifference. And it is in this that the gods may have seen a reflection of their death, not through war, but through erasure. The Black Library contains encrypted entries that hint at such a convergence. In particular, a record titled The Threnody Protocol, encoded by the Eldar seer Ithrael Vey, tells of a psychic crescendo in the 36th Millennium, during which warp harmonics shifted dramatically. Vey recorded an alignment, a momentary convergence of opposing warp signatures, as if the four powers had sung a single note. The note was never heard again, but in its echo, whole stars dimmed, and 3 craft worlds reported psychic disintegration in their farseer matrices. Even among the demonic ranks, there is a whisper of this lost war. In rare invocations of Lords of Change, a certain phrase can provoke inexplicable responses. The Hollow Crown. Normally arrogant and cryptic, some Lords of Change become erratic or violently agitated upon hearing it. Some lapse into silence, others scream until they dissipate. What the phrase means, none can say, but it suggests trauma, and trauma, in a being of eternal cunning, is rare. Some radical inquisitors argue that this brief unity among the Chaos Gods was not a truce, but a suppression. That together they birthed a weapon, a metaphysical plague designed to counter the rising god of absence. Something we might now call the Black Crusades, or the inception of psychic null zones. Perhaps the pariah gene, that cursed trait of psychic nothingness, is not an imperial accident, but a chaos invention. A last resort to poison their own plane in order to kill the cancer blooming in its heart. If true, then the irony is exquisite. That the Chaos Gods, in their blind loathing, may have created the tool the Emperor would later wield to hold back their tide. A tool that also buried their mutual shame. Because if there was ever a moment when the ruinous powers acted together, they would want no memory of it. It would be antithetical to everything they are. Unity, for them, is blasphemy. They would erase even themselves to forget it. There exists a cluster of stars near the edges of the segmentum tempestus, where even the Adeptus Mechanicus dares not send exploratory craft. These are the schism worlds, so named not because of political upheaval or rebellion, but because their very existence represents a fracture in the historical record. Between the late 35th and early 37th millennia, a series of systems, once vibrant and integrated into the Imperium's logistical networks, vanished from every known channel of communication. Not obliterated, lost. No war records, no exterminatus logs, no Xenos invasion markings, just blank spaces in the void. These systems, Narath, Vexilar, Duralis, among others, were all noted for unusual cultural development. They did not produce major tithes, nor did they field notable Imperial Guard regiments, but they excelled in one shared quality: philosophical divergence. Each of them hosted sects and social movements that strayed from imperial dogma, not in overt heresy, but in subtle deviation. Citizens practiced ritual silence. Administrative lexicons grew more symbolic and abstract. Some ceased referring to the emperor as a god, describing him instead as a necessary stillness. Others developed linguistic systems devoid of metaphor or implication, pure denotative syntax the stripping away of emotional content. The Inquisition was slow to react, at first seeing these movements as eccentric rather than dangerous. But by the time reports began to converge on a spreading emotional stagnation, a cultural entropy that bled passion from the population, it was already too late. Astropathic messages became garbled, not from interference, but from semantic collapse. Choirs could not interpret them. It was as if the very purpose of language had been drained. When Task Force Vigilance was dispatched to the Narath system in M36, 412, it reported clear atmospheric conditions, intact infrastructure, and zero hostile contact. Yet the entirety of Narath Prime's 20 billion inhabitants stood motionless, in homes, in fields, in manufactoria, silent, waiting, not dead, not demonic, simply still. A single line was found inscribed across every data slate and cogitator screen on the planet. The pattern completes when watched. What followed is one of the most comprehensive military purges in Imperial history, and one of the most thoroughly redacted. The scouring of the schism worlds was conducted not with honor, but with terror. Not a crusade, but a containment. Entire fleets were repurposed into psychic null bombs. Battle brothers of the Exorcist chapter, trained specifically to resist demonic corruption, were deployed, only to return changed. Their memories of the conflict fragmented, riddled with gaps. Some refused to speak at all. Others wrote compulsively, transcribing nonsense patterns until their deaths. One Astartes reportedly carved a spiral of zeros into the hull of his ship's bridge and walked out into the void without his helmet, whispering, "I have met the end, and it didn't care." Mechanicus records, recovered from a secretive data archive on Ryza, reveal something more chilling. Prior to the purge, Duralis had begun transmitting a mathematical proof, one that described a closed system of logic so absolute that it rendered all contradiction meaningless. The tech priests who reviewed it began exhibiting strange behaviors, ceasing to maintain systems, removing unnecessary wiring, even refusing to speak unless prompted with direct binary stimuli. The proof was eventually classified as a mimetic hazard and purged. But some believe it was not a mathematical theorem. It was a prayer. A digital hymn to something that offered perfection not through complexity, but through reduction. From this, the theory grows darker, that the schism worlds were not just philosophical aberrations, but temples. That these societies, knowingly or not, became incubators for a fifth god of chaos, a deity whose worship was not conducted in reverence or passion, but in silence. That their deviation was not error, but sacrament, and that the scouring was not a war, but an exorcism on a galactic scale. No known artifacts remain from the schism worlds. All databanks were scorched, all records purged. Even the star charts were edited. But voidfarers still speak of that region with unease. They say Vox signals weaken near those stars, that Auspex scans return not emptiness, but gray zones, not dark, but faded, as if reality itself is tired, the kind of fatigue that precedes forgetting. Warp echoes are not uncommon. They are the immaterium's endless memory, repeating emotion, trauma, and desire through eternity. A dying world might echo with screams for millennia. A bloody betrayal might manifest again and again as a demonic reenactment. But during the 36th Millennium, certain warp echoes began to emerge that did not follow this pattern. They were not violent. They were not seductive. They did not weep or writhe. They whispered. They receded. They felt wrong, not in the way of chaos, but in the way of silence pressing in where there should be noise. Imperial psychers, those unfortunate souls who serve as humanity's tenuous connection to the warp, began reporting dreams not of monsters, but of stillness. Vast white plains, endless corridors with no doors. The dreams did not hurt. They did not inspire madness. They inspired something worse, disinterest. Those afflicted stopped caring. They became less, Some starved to death because they forgot to eat. Others walked into the void of space, not out of compulsion, but because nothing seemed more meaningful than anything else. These were not isolated cases. In regions once touched by the suspected rise of the fifth power, near the schism worlds, near the astronomican's flickers, these echoes were strongest. In the warp, screaming voids opened and remained, not anomalies of demonic activity, but holes in resonance. No sound, no feeling. Ships passing near these zones often reported technical malfunctions, but more disturbingly, crews began forgetting things. Names, mission objectives, even how to speak. One infamous case involved the destroyer Virtuous Gale, which emerged from warp transit with all systems functional and no signs of damage, save that its crew had rewritten the ship's entire lexicon in circles and lines. No known language, no emotion, just loops. The Ordo Psychana developed containment protocols for these phenomena. Null script bleed, they called it. A theoretical side effect of contact with the anti-resonant signature of something that once was, a deity of negation whose death did not cleanse the warp, but left behind psychic scabs. Just as a soul's torment can echo eternally, so too can the disintegration of will. In fact, it may echo longer, because no emotion is more adhesive than nothing. No wound harder to close than the one that refuses to bleed. Demonologists began noticing something else. Certain warp storms didn't pulse or roar. They paused. In these pauses, demons would hesitate. Even warp predators like the Screaming Maw or the Flame Drinker would lose cohesion. They'd ripple, then vanish. Not banished, not destroyed. Gone. Some inquisitors believe this is the lingering echo of the fifth power's purge, a memory of stillness so potent it can undo beings made from motion. Astropathic choirs report moments of collective dissociation during communications across these zones. They find themselves listening to themselves listening, unable to remember what they were transmitting. Even more disturbing are the residual recordings, repeated sequences of the phrase, "We are the not," and "less is after." Not languages, not codes, just fractured reflections of something once vocal, now decomposed into entropy. There are places in the warp now marked in red by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, not because they are demonic, but because they are too quiet. The screaming silence of Kadavar's Reach, the ash breath corridor near Ultima Segmentum. These names sound dramatic, but what is encountered there is anti-dramatic, a vacuum of resonance. Ships passing through experience no demonic attacks, no Geller field disruptions, but they often emerge with no functioning cogitators, no mission memory, and crews who stare into nothing for hours, unable to articulate why. Perhaps the most telling sign of the fifth power's echo lies not in what is found, but in what is not. In gaps of emotion, in blank pages, in the feeling that something is missing, and the realization that you don't care enough to find it. The warp, it seems, remembers even things we have forgotten, and that memory, robbed of name and shape, still haunts the void, not as a god, not as a demon, but as the final echo of apathy made manifest. There are things the Inquisition fears so greatly that they do not burn them, they bury them. Some of these are physical artifacts, others are texts, but a few are ideas, concepts so insidious that to even think them is to risk contagion. One such concept is the survival of a god not in form, but in echo, in whisper, in the slow resurgence of a thought that once ruled without name. And as the 41st millennium groans toward its twilight, there are signs that this forbidden thought, the memory of the fifth power, is beginning to seep back into reality. Across hive worlds and void fleets, whispers move among the outcast and the mad. Cults form not in alleys drenched with blood or pleasure, but in abandoned stations and data crypts. These are not covens of corn or cabals of Tzinch. These are communities without leaders, without names, without prayers. They congregate in silence. They purge emotion from speech. They speak only when necessary, and then only in function. The Inquisition has begun to catalog them under the growing threat index, nameless heresy. These modern heresies do not seek power. They do not even seek change. They seek to remove, to undo, to pare down existence until it becomes optional. One cell uncovered on Malfi had rewritten every religious tract they could find, reducing them to tautologies and loops. The Emperor was the one who is when things are, and chaos was that which isn't when we don't. It reads as madness, but to psychers exposed to it, the effect was devastating. One astropath burst into laughter and died. Another entered a coma, muttering, "I don't need to be." More alarming still are the sigils, unmistakably distinct from the marks of the Four. These symbols are geometric reductions, shapes that appear incomplete and yet perfect. Not quite circles, not quite spirals. They appear on walls, on skin, in the margins of texts. They are not drawn. They are revealed, as if memory had been waiting to recall them. The Ordo Hereticus has declared them mimetic hazards. The Ordo Xenos remains silent. Certain Black Templars have reported encountering gray demons, entities not of writhing flesh or shrieking madness, but of shifting dull surfaces. Beings that do not speak, do not strike, but unmake. Bolters do not tear their flesh, they simply disappear. Librarians attempting psychic assault are rendered mute. These reports are suppressed, of course, but rumors travel faster than ships. Among certain Death Watch kill teams, the phrase null-born has become a shorthand for these foes. It is not a term of fear, it is a term of wariness. Because if these things exist, they are not demons. They are ideas given flesh. And worse, ideas that don't want to be known. Radical inquisitors theorize that these modern heresies are not spontaneous. They are psychic aftershocks. The fifth god, if it ever existed, was not killed but fractured, reduced below the level of conscious thought. But consciousness is not the only layer of existence. If the warp is shaped by belief, then unconscious fear, apathy, and erosion are still belief, still power. And as the galaxy collapses under war and entropy, the perfect breeding ground may once again be forming. Not with shrines, but with silence. Not with praise, but with indifference. There are even accounts, quiet, suppressed, of loyalist psychers dreaming of white plains, of nameless shapes, of vast, slow-moving geometries. These are not visions. These are realignments. Psychic systems, long tuned to the clamor of chaos or the beacon of the Emperor, are beginning to resonate with something else. A frequency that demands nothing, promises nothing, and simply exists. A presence that smiles not with joy, but with neutrality. Perhaps this is the fate of all gods, to rise, to fall, and to return not as fire, but as fog. To linger in the edges of thought until summoned again, not by cult or creed, but by the decay of meaning. And as more and more corners of the galaxy fall into silence, the question is no longer whether the fifth power existed. The question is how long we can pretend it doesn't. If there was ever a god who died, not in war, not in defiance, but in erasure, then it has left us with a question so profound it borders on horror. Can the universe forget something it once needed to survive? In the grimdark reality of Warhammer 40,000, we are used to confronting endless war, the ruin of hope, and the savage certainty of chaos. But this is different. The idea that a fifth power of the warp once existed and was so dangerous that it had to be made unreal tears at the very metaphysical foundation of the galaxy. It suggests that belief is not the only force shaping reality. That forgetting, strategically and collectively, is power too. What does it mean that an entire epic may have been built around the removal of an idea? That faith, the cornerstone of both the Imperium and chaos, was insufficient to explain, or contain, what arose in the 36th Millennium. That even the gods of madness, of despair and decay, could not abide a thing whose strength came not from fire or pleasure or pain, but from neutrality. To kill such a being is not enough. To kill it would be to acknowledge it. And so they did something worse. They made it not real. And yet, it lingers. In forbidden sigils that appear in the margins of forgotten books. In warp echoes that do not scream, but refuse to speak. In psychers who can no longer dream. In cults that worship with silence. In the moment a soldier hesitates, not from fear, but because the fight has lost its meaning. That is the real terror. Not that a god died, but that its afterimage still crawls through the cracks of thought, waiting not to return, but to be remembered. It was never a god of conquest, never a god of flesh. It was not glory, not rot, not manipulation, not excess. It was the quiet between stars, the white noise between prayers, the entropy of intent, the cessation of will. And perhaps even now, in the shadows of the 42nd Millennium, it stirs again, not with ambition, but with inevitability. Not to rise, but to resume. If you've listened this far, you might be feeling something difficult to name. Not awe, not fear, but something else. A pressure in your chest. A sense of emptiness that is not painful, just present. That is its echo. That is the shape it left behind. And now you know. Now you've remembered. And with that act of remembrance, you've given it shape again. Do not speak its name. There isn't one. There never was. But its symbol is the space you just thought about. Its altar is your forgetting. Its temple is the sentence you skipped, the word you didn't quite read, the dream you didn't recall upon waking. And if you want to keep uncovering the deep, strange, and terrible truths of the Warhammer universe, subscribe. Not just for the lore, but to keep that forgotten god from slipping away again. To keep remembering what we were never meant to know.